initiative. Another theory was that it was a matter of getting in some last licks, as it were, before a possible peace initiative took effect, or possibly to try to hurry it up, to say it better happen because we're serious.
Soviet President Gorbachev floated the peace proposal at a time of enormous discord at home. Just today, rival Boris Yeltsin accused Gorbachev of moving toward dictatorship and called for his removal. Why then did Gorbachev launch an initiative that runs a risk of failing? And why would he join the Allied coalition and then appear to break from it? We asked correspondent Jim Laurie in Moscow.
For some time here in Moscow, it's been apparent that two forces are at work pushing Gorbachev in two different foreign policy directions. First, there's the military and the hardline communists who feel that Gorbachev has tilted perhaps a bit too far toward Washington. And then there is the reformers' view, that once held by Edward Shevardnadze, that the American relationship must be paramount.
The Kremlin poured over $25 billion into the Iraqi military in the past decade. And that may also help explain why the Soviets want the fighting to stop now, before the war machine it helped create faces possible mass destruction.
The Soviet military would clearly not like to see American weapons beating Soviet weapons in a decisive land battle so close to the Soviet borders. It's a humiliation for the military, and we have to recognize that this is not the old Gorbachev that we like so much. This is the new Gorbachev, who seems to be more responsive to the concerns of the military and the KGB.
Are the U.S. and Soviet Union on different tracks in the Persian Gulf crisis? What's known of the Soviet plan would suggest they are. For example, Moscow reportedly assured Saddam Hussein's envoy that the Iraqi leader will not be punished if he agrees to withdraw from Kuwait. But just 5 days ago, President Bush encouraged the popular overthrow of Saddam.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside and then comply with the United Nations resolutions and rejoin the family of peace-loving nations.
Despite the differences, despite the president's public rejection of the Soviet plan, there may be some room to maneuver. That according to John McWethy, who's been talking to American diplomats.
There have been, according to these officials, some omissions on the part of the Soviets and some things that the Bush administration would like changed in their specific language. But if Saddam Hussein were to say tonight yes to that Soviet proposal, and if he were to start withdrawing his troops, then these officials say the war would be over.
Still, this is the most significant issue to develop since the Cold War ended. A former ambassador to the Soviet Union says the peace initiative will test the resiliency of the new relationship.
If it was a reasonable proposal, if it was just designed to get the Iraqis to accept the UN Security Council resolutions, then I don't think there's any permanent damage to the relationship. If it accepts some of the hidden and open conditionality of the Iraqis, then it seems to me it will cause a real damage to relationships with the United States.
Administration officials reportedly feel that a victory is within reach in the Gulf War, and they're reluctant to squander momentum, not only militarily, but also politically. An ABC News poll out today shows 85% of the public supporting a ground war. So it may be that regardless of the consequences on U.S.-Soviet relations, the time may have passed for a diplomatic solution to end the war. This is Jackie Judd for Nightline in Washington.
Later in this broadcast, you'll see the first pictures in this war shot by a reporter from the cockpit of a Saudi jet fighter on a bombing run over enemy territory. But first, we'll be joined by two members. The number of Allied sorties reached 83,000 today, missions designed to destroy as much of the Iraqi military as possible before any ground war begins. In this exclusive report, Nightline correspondent Farah Sawyer was permitted to fly with the Saudi Air Force and to record a bombing mission from start to finish.
Our target is an artillery battalion.
11:40 a.m. The battlefield preparations begin here. Saudi pilots briefing for another bombing run. With Nightline's camera present, it is in English.
And as usual, by the air, we got the air supremacy, so there's no activity from the enemy side.
The goal, to hit a specific target in a designated killing zone, part of a relentless search and destroy campaign preparing for the ground assault.
Do not drop your bombs except on the assigned target. If you cannot positively identify your target, keep your bombs.
The aircraft, British-made Tornado fighter bombers, the Saudi workhorse for the assault on Saddam's ground forces. And they're effective. Key Saudi sources claim the destruction of Iraq's armor and artillery is far greater than official estimates, as high as 70%. Others agree official figures are cautious.
In that kind of operations, always very conservative figures. So we always go with the most conservative figures that we have proofs of.
Keeping track of the pilots, a state-of-the-art computer system keyed into information provided by AWACS radar planes. Without the Saudi monitoring system, the skies over Kuwait would be far more dangerous.
If there is a danger, you know, it's a danger that you are fighting to your way from going from A to B, you know, trying to avoid friendly airplanes because so concentrated.
Pilot, how did it?
Loud and clear, sir.
Okay, 34 left, 3003, clear taxi.
Copy.
2:22 p.m. The Tornadoes lift off. They're flying just over the Kuwaiti border. Part of an attack wave that is now focusing on the front lines. They're accompanied by two F-15s, the plane that convinced Saudi pilots that they are world-class. It was one of their men who scored the war's first double kill, 2 Iraqi F-1 Mirages in one engagement.
Roger, bandits, boss, target destroyed, boss, target destroyed.
Saudi F-15 pilots say they expect to play a key role in the ground battle, holding off any Iraqi pilot who tries to fly against coalition troops.
I think if they would like to die, I could make it easier for them.
3 p.m. For the first time in the war, an Allied bombing mission is recorded by a reporter traveling in the second seat of the F-15. The flight follows along the coast until the Tornadoes launch their high-altitude assault. When the F-15 maneuvers for a second camera shot, you quickly learn how much power the plane has.
I was only putting 2 Gs, that's all. So, you know, that's a very simple maneuver that we do. And as soon as you make that turn, you just said, well, I look at it in the mirror back and I saw you that you can't really hack it.
No independent verification was offered, but on the ground, the weapons officers, called WIZOs, say the mission was a success.
I was seeing the targets in my radar. It was very clear. We marked it, and it was directed.
It is expected that just before the ground war begins, coalition pilots will launch a massive air assault along the front lines. Many pilots are saying their biggest problem will be finding targets that haven't already been destroyed. Ted?
Forrest, if the success of the Allied bombing raids has been as great as some of these Saudi officers are telling you, why indeed is it necessary to go in with a ground assault?
Well, it's a difficult question, and as you see tonight, one that's been debated. But as they say, they feel that the timing is here, the window for the assault is appropriate, and there are many people who feel that it might simply be a mopping-up operation, that Iraqis have deserted their posts, and that when the fight comes from the American forces and the coalition forces, they'll simply put their hands up and surrender.
All right, Faraz Soya, thanks very much indeed.
This is a Gulf War update.
I'm John McKenzie in New York. The Iranian foreign minister in Paris for talks with French President Mitterrand said the world will have to wait until tomorrow to learn whether Iraq will accept a Soviet peace proposal. In Washington, Secretary of State Baker said the U.S. position in the Gulf is crystal clear and leaves no room for negotiation.
Iraq must leave Kuwait immediately, totally, and unconditionally, and Iraq must comply fully with the other applicable Security Council resolutions. Anything short of that is unacceptable.
This has been a Gulf War update.
This is KPIX Eyewitness News at noon.
And good afternoon. I'm Liz Gonzalez, and topping the news, a full-scale ground attack is on hold as the world waits for the Iraqi response to the Soviet peace plan. But that doesn't mean it's been quiet in the desert. Nearly 500 Iraqi soldiers were taken prisoner when U.S. helicopters attacked just north of the Saudi border today. The helicopter assault took out more than a dozen enemy bunkers. More sign that a full-scale ground assault probably isn't too far off. Secretary of State James Baker said this morning that Kuwait would be liberated soon. A French commander, however, says that the ground campaign will not come in the next 48 hours. And the commander of the U.S. forces in the Gulf says the Iraqi army is, quote, on the verge of collapse. In a newspaper interview, General Norman Schwarzkopf described the Iraqi forces as hurting very badly. On the diplomatic front, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz had been expected to return to Moscow today. Now the Soviets say it's okay if he doesn't come back at all. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry says it is not necessary for Aziz to deliver Saddam's response in person.
It was understood when Tariq Aziz was here in Moscow on Monday that the Iraqi side can deliver its response through our embassy in Baghdad.
Churkin says that President Gorbachev has not set a deadline for Saddam's response, but the Kremlin would like it as soon as possible. According to Iran's foreign minister and a French lawmaker, the Iraqi leader has just 24 hours. The French say that they have learned the Allies will give Saddam until Thursday night to respond, but there has been no confirmation of that from Washington. The Speaker of the House says that President Bush faces a delicate decision if Iraq does accept the 11th hour Soviet peace proposal. Tom Foley says it would be tough for the president not to accept the Soviet plan. On the other hand, it would leave Saddam in power, and that could create problems in the Gulf for years to come. President Bush has said that the Soviet plan falls, quote, well short of what's required to end the war. An Iraqi delegation showed up in Beijing last night. Their mission, to get the Chinese to join the Soviets in pressuring the U.S. to stop the bombing. The Iraqis believe that if the Chinese fall in line, Iraq could make it look as if President Bush is prolonging the war against the opposition of the other big powers. While diplomats are looking for a peaceful way out of the war, the Allied troops are clashing with the enemy and looking for gaps in Iraqi defenses just in case. Peter Van Sant has more on the preparations on the ground.
The U.S. military here says it is ready to attack, that it is just waiting for the order to invade from President Bush. Military officials this morning are also describing the Iraqi forces as being on the verge of collapse, signaling that a ground war may begin soon. All across northern Saudi Arabia, coalition armored units are on the move. Hundreds of tanks stretching across the horizon are assembling in numbers not seen since World War II. There are published reports this morning that some coalition tanks have made forays into Kuwait in the past 2 days, which is seen as a prelude to a major invasion. These are American tanks from the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, which are expected to spearhead a strike into Kuwait. U.S. military commanders say their soldiers are ready for war.
To be honest with you, I feel that we ought to just go in there and do the job. I mean, they've talked long enough, talk's got nowhere.
Coalition forces continue to pound Iraqi troops inside Kuwait in preparation for a ground assault. The commander of U.S. forces, General Norman Schwarzkopf, is now saying that the intensive bombing has put the Iraqi army on the verge of collapse, that they are hurting very badly. A British spokesman says this artillery pounding is paying off.
With the artillery, we are attacking as much the will of the Iraqi soldier to resist as we are attacking the means by which he resists.
That was Peter Van Sant reporting. One of this nation's most decorated living soldiers is Colonel David Hackworth. He's in Saudi Arabia covering the Gulf War for a national magazine. CBS correspondent Harry Smith caught up with him and asked him his impression of the war and where it stands today.
I feel the war is over. Certainly, as a military instrument, the Iraqi army is defeated. It's just a question now of will Saddam Hussein be rational enough to realize this and save his forces any further punishment or get out.
Hackworth has been opposed to the Gulf War from the beginning. Even people who strongly believe in the war have found their support wavering after seeing scenes of civilian bomb damage. Baghdad knows this, and today, new pictures cleared by Iraqi censors of one of the areas hard hit by Allied bombing. The town of Mosul is some 400 kilometers north of Baghdad. The Allies have said that they do all they can to avoid striking civilian targets, but that some damage is unavoidable. Some help for the civilian casualties of the war arrived in Iraq from Tehran today. Supplies from UNICEF are being stored in a safe warehouse some 60 kilometers outside of Baghdad. The Iraqi foreign minister called on UNICEF officials to expose what he calls U.S. crimes against the Iraqis.
And all indications are that it could happen soon. What Iraqi defenses await Allied soldiers? We'll show you what the GIs in the trenches might find when they cross that line.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Ted Koppel.
Within a week or so, perhaps even within the next day, we will have the answers to many of the questions that now trouble us. We will know the specifics of the Soviet peace proposal and Saddam Hussein's response to it. Even more to the point, we will know whether both the proposal and the reply will have been acceptable to the President of the United States, or whether he will determine that a ground war was simply unavoidable. By next week at this time, the questions which hang so heavily over us tonight will have been displaced by other, perhaps even more troublesome ones. But for the moment, it is the prospect or the possible avoidance of that land war that still captures our attention. That, then, will be the main focus of our broadcast this evening. A closer look at what a land war would entail. We begin, though, with a summary by Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield of the unanswered questions that now lie before us.
The whole point of a newscast is to tell you what we know, or think we know, about what's going on in the world. Sometimes we can sound very confident about this. You give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world, some say. But there are times when the most honest thing we can tell you is what we don't know. And tonight, with rumors of peace plans and ground war plans filling the air, that's what we're going to do. For instance, just what is in the Soviet peace plan that the Iraqis are supposedly considering now? Does it include an immediate, unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait, as UN resolutions demand? Does it protect Iraq from paying reparations to Kuwait? Reparations that are clearly envisioned in UN policy.
It's a very volatile situation, so you cannot make statements which would apply and stick forever. It's a situation which can change from hour to hour.
Here in Moscow, we know very little about the Gorbachev plan. The Soviets have maintained a total silence on the precise contents and have called reports that have come out inaccurate. Glasnost is not providing very many leaks here. Soviet officials will only say the plan is in accord with UN resolutions, demands withdrawal without conditions. It provides for the preservation of Iraq's territorial integrity, and comments by the foreign minister suggest the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict is also brought up.
What does Iraq intend to do about this plan? Today, in France, Iran's foreign minister said the world would have to wait until tomorrow to find out what Iraq would do. Tonight, Baghdad radio said that the Revolutionary Command Council had decided to send Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to Moscow soon to reply to the plan. But there was no hint of what soon meant or what that reply would be. Whatever Iraq decides, has the West imposed a clear deadline, after which a ground war will begin? In Paris today, a high-ranking French legislator said Iraq had 24 hours to answer or risk a ground war. But that wasn't what American military sources were saying.
I know of no date for a ground campaign. I have been given no date for a ground campaign. The president will make that decision, and I would assume at some point it would filter down to me, and it hasn't.
But suppose Iraq does decide to give up, to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait. What exactly does that mean from the Allied viewpoint? Must they leave their weapons in Kuwait? Must they withdraw just over the Kuwaiti border or further inland so they pose no further threat of aggression to Kuwait? Here's what Secretary of State Baker said today.
Iraq must leave Kuwait immediately, totally, and unconditionally, and Iraq must comply fully with the other applicable Security Council resolutions.
We also do not know whether the United States would really consider a withdrawal from Kuwait a victory. Press speculation today again suggested that Washington might find itself in a dilemma if Saddam Hussein followed the UN mandates in a way that kept him in power. That Saddam Hussein's removal from power is a key element of what Washington wants. But that goal is clearly not what the UN says the fighting is all about. There's also debate about what the Soviet Union wants, to simply end the war or to position itself for a key role in the post-war Middle East. One Soviet scholar says Moscow itself is divided between the views of the former foreign minister and the present foreign minister.
One view, which was represented by Shevardnadze, is that we should sacrifice the Middle East for the sake of Soviet-American relations. And another view, which is presented by Primakov and people like him, is that we should play an intermediate role, a role of a broker in this conflict and in the more general conflict between the West and the Third World.
It's ironic, of course. A modern news organization can reach anywhere around the world instantaneously and still not know all that much about what's really happening. But remember, you heard it here first. Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
There are, of course, some things we do know with the help of experts and analysts. And when we come back, ABC's military affairs analyst, Tony Kortesman, will show us what Allied forces will find behind Iraqi lines when the ground war begins. He's been the national security analyst for ABC News since the Gulf War began. Prior to that, he was the director of Defense Intelligence Assessment at the Pentagon, held foreign posts with the State Department, served as national security assistant to Senator John McCain, and taught national security studies at Georgetown University. By the way, the defense information you're about to see is not classified, is known to the Iraqis. We thought you might be interested as well. Tony, why don't we begin by your giving us an overview of what the coalition forces are going to find if and when they move into Kuwait in a massive way?
Well, Ted, we have quite a number of different ways they can move in. And if we take a look at the map, we can see that many of them are designed as much as possible to bypass Iraqi defenses, to sweep around their forces, to get around their forward forces, to operate far in the rear. But no matter what we do, we are going to have to go through some of the most formidable defenses in the world. We do have some satellite coverage of what those defenses look like, and they give us an introduction to the problems our troops will face. If we look over here and we look at these lines through here, these are deep anti-tank barriers. In front of them are minefields. And these lines here are supply roads which allow their armor and mechanized forces in the rear to reinforce these defenses. And they extend along virtually all the border of Kuwait. As we move forward, looking at these forces, we see they're 6 miles deep. These are not shallow or simple defenses, easy to penetrate. And let's take a closer look at what these defenses really are. The first positions our troops are going to meet are isolated strong points, small ones, far in advance of the forward defenses. These can hold scouts, which will allow their artillery to target on our advancing forces and inform their commanders in the rear of the direction we're coming in.
Tony, let me just stop you there and have you give us a little more of a detailed description of what that is that we're looking at. You say it's small. How big? What are those, essentially sandbags?
Well, those would be sandbags. They could also be a hill in the desert. All of the things we're going to show, Ted, are sort of an artist's image. The real Iraqi commanders will dig in and take advantage of the terrain. The defenses will be adapted everywhere the Allied forces have to advance, so they won't look the same. They will take advantage of every hill, every possible barrier they can find.
And when you talk about hills, we have a tendency to think of the desert as being flat. It is not, of course.
Not at all. The further west you go, the rougher the terrain gets. But even near the coast, a height of only a few meters, 3 to 6 feet, is enough to hide men and equipment from the oncoming Allied forces.
All right, take us beyond those forward emplacements then, if you would.
Let's go on to the defenses we saw, those trenches we saw in the satellite photos, and begin by moving forward just as our own troops would be. The next position we would see are these areas here. Now, we've uncovered them, but they'd be minefields, and in general, they would be at least 400 meters deep, anywhere from 1,200 feet to, in some cases, possibly a mile. Inside them will be at least 2 kinds of mines, anti-personnel and anti-armor, mixed together. There'll also be other kinds of mines designed to stop people from moving through these or sweeping these fields. And some experts feel there may even be mines that have chemical weapons in them.
All right, we are later on going to come back to each of these emplacements and each of these defenses and explain what U.S. countermeasures could be or are likely to be, but let's keep moving on. Behind the mines, then?
Behind the mines, in most cases, will come the deep anti-tank trenches that we saw earlier. These trenches, as we move forward, will have other minefields, possibly razor wire in front of them. Some of these trenches will be filled with oil. Others will have drums of napalm. They can light the oil in some cases to create smoke. In still other cases, they will leave it unlit because if equipment has to move through it or personnel, the contamination from the oil can often inhibit military relations. Beyond that is what we call razor wire.
Before you get to the razor wire, Tony, those look more like ravines than ditches or trenches. How big are those trenches?
Well, they will generally be at least 6 to 8 feet deep. They can be anywhere from 6 to 15 feet across. They are designed to be formidable barriers that can't easily be filled in by tanks with bulldozers or other countermeasures.
All right, now on to the barbed wire.
Well, barbed wire or razor wire is a really formidable barrier to equipment as well as people, and it will be very, very deep. Now, beyond that, we come to the first major forward defense positions. The berm we see here, in some cases, can be virtually flat. In other cases, it could be as high as 10 meters. So in some cases, it will be so high that they can dig inside and put shelters inside of it. On top of it or nearby will be fortified defense positions, sometimes with sandbags, sometimes with the concrete pillboxes we see here.
And then, Tony, because we need to take a break in about 40 seconds or so, that triangular configuration that we see behind the berm, what is that?
That's yet another form of fortification. To get through the berm, they'll come up against what's called a PETA, a mixture of infantry strong points, and inside will be tanks, artillery pieces, and sometimes anti-air weaponry.
All right, you've given us a formidable sense now of what is confronting Allied troops when they move into Kuwait. We're going to take a break. When we come back, Tony Kordersman will give us a sense of how it is that the Allied forces will overcome each of these impediments. Back in a moment. And we are back again with ABC's military analyst, Tony Kordersman. Tony, we were talking before about the defensive measures that the Iraqis have in place. Take us through now, beginning at the same spot that we began before, the countermeasures that the Allied forces are likely to take to overcome each of these defensive measures.
Well, Ted, remember, in every case, we've been pounding these positions for days. Before our ground forces advance, we will have used fuel-air explosives, very high, large bombs like the Daisy Cutters, cluster bombs that drop lots of bomblets of anti-personnel and anti-armor. Forward defense positions like this will have been hit from the air. As we move forward, our tanks and infantry will find them, and then we'll come to the minefields. Once again, many of these will have been bombed. Most of the mines will be gone.
What kind of bombs do they use, Tony, on the minefields?
Well, they can use fuel-air explosives, or they can use very heavy bombs like the Daisy Cutters, which, by the sheer shock, detonate the mines.
And what about the fuel-air explosives? What do they do?
The same thing. What they do is create a very broad explosive pressure on the ground, which will detonate most of these mines. Where they fail, we can use tanks that have special mine plows, or which allow them to roll over the minefields. We have rockets that shoot shaped charges of explosives. Then we come to these trenches. Those are a problem, but we have tanks with bridges that can lay down the bridge in front of them, then drive right over that bridge and be followed by other armored vehicles and infantry. We also, again, can use bombs selectively now to get these breached to fill them in. With the razor wire, it's the same story.
Before you get to the razor wire, Tony, to the layperson, I must say this notion of having these ravines filled with oil, which in theory could be set on fire, at least psychologically, that creates an enormous barrier. You're telling me that the blazing oil is not that much of a problem?
It really isn't, because with the tanks we have, with the ability to use bombs, again, some of the bombs are so powerful, they can basically put the fire out. Tanks with dozers can fill them in. Bombs can fill them in. Yes, they're formidable if you don't have the kind of air assets we have. They're not formidable given the kind of strength we have.
All right, as you move on now to the razor wire, and talk a little bit more about what kind of barbed wire is involved there, also take into account, if you would, that presumably our forces are going to be under attack, even as they are moving forward.
That's right. Throughout this, however, the best they will have are artillery, anti-tank weapons, some tanks that are dug in up to their hulls. We're going to have the full range of air power, Apaches, A-10s, F-15Es. We will also have our long-range artillery. We have almost perfect reconnaissance and targeting capability. They only have line of sight. So they will be a lethal problem, but we have a vast superiority in the ability to concentrate firepower from both air and land in this one narrow area where we have to advance.
All right, let us assume then that they've made it safely through, across that huge ditch, through the barbed wire, or over what is left of the barbed wire. Now what faces them, and what countermeasures do they take?
Now we face, again, the berms, these high mounds. Those are fairly difficult to penetrate if you don't have air power. But remember, when you are dropping 10,000, 2,000-pound bombs, covering these positions, and they must come up out of their shelters to fight us with cluster bombs, they lose an awful lot of their capability. Behind these are what we see, these triangles, which we call lapidas. In each corner is infantry. As we look inside, we see armor, something that worked well against the Iraqis that had no air power, but they're extremely vulnerable to our combination of air and land power, a tactic better designed to fight a different enemy in a different place.
Very quickly, Tony, what is the magic of the triangle? Why do they have them in that triangular configuration?
Well, two positions forward act as a forward defense. The infantry in the rear can reinforce. By sheltering their armored vehicles behind berms, they're less vulnerable to anti-tank weapons from the ground. But of course, we have the A-10s, we have the AH-64s. We're not fighting the way the Iranians did.
Now, what we left out before is, of course, the main force. And how much of a main force should they still expect to find if they get beyond each of these positions?
Well, let's take a brief look at the map. Along this side is the forward set of positions we've just talked about. Behind that are reinforcing divisions, these orange forces, behind them armored and mechanized divisions, and then finally in this area the Republican Guards. But we think right now that only about half of that force at most is combat capable, and a lot of it is dug in so well that it's going to find it difficult to fight. Nevertheless, let's see how well they can dig in. They have positions like this tank which can drive up a step, move without exposing itself, locate our targets as they advance, fire, and then either drive out or retreat back under their camouflage netting and shelter.
All right, Tony, we've done a very quick once-over lightly on the land assault. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'd appreciate if you'd just take a couple of minutes to give us a sense of what lies ahead of the amphibious forces. And we are back once again with ABC News military analyst Tony Kordersman. Tony, we have talked about the land assault, and now I'd appreciate if you would show us, if in fact there is a marine amphibious landing, how would that take place, and what countermeasures would the Iraqis have in place?
Well, Ted, let's look very briefly again at the map. All of these forces along here have only one mission: to defend Iraq and Kuwait against an amphibious landing. And that is a very real threat the Iraqis face, because if we look at the weapons and capabilities of our amphibious forces, again, we can mount a very wide range of assets. Hovercraft, which can move very, very quickly over the beach. Tracked vehicles, which can move equally quickly. Backed by ships, landing craft the size of most other aircraft carriers. A force of some 17,000 men, but calling it amphibious is no longer accurate anymore. About half of that force can move by helicopter, backed by attack helicopters with their own anti-tank capability, supported by Harrier jump jets with close air support capability, and F-18s, which are also lethal fighters. This is a force which can move not only over the beach, but directly into cities, combined with the air assault forces. So the Iraqis have no way to know where it's coming, and no way to know what mixture of air and land assault will take place.
Is it that element of surprise, Tony? Because I can imagine if they had to face the same kind of defensive installations that the ground forces have to face, that would be a rather daunting prospect, wouldn't it?
It would indeed, but they don't face that kind of entrenched defense. They can move behind the defenses the Iraqis do have. They can force the Iraqis into a meeting engagement where the Iraqis lose their defensive advantage.
All right, Tony Quartersman, thank you very much. Tomorrow night on Primetime Live, you'll hear the harrowing tales of Iraqis who crossed mountains and minefields to escape Saddam Hussein. And ABC News will follow developments on the Soviet peace plan, as well as all the latest news from the Persian Gulf tomorrow on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good.
This is KPIX Eyewitness News at noon.
And good afternoon. I'm Liz Gonzalez, and topping the news, the liberation of Kuwait continues. That's the bottom line from the White House after hearing Saddam Hussein's radio speech this morning, a speech that one Pentagon official called a suicide note for Iraqi troops. In Iraq, people hung on every word, 40 minutes of defiance that could determine their fate.
There is no other way other than that which we have chosen, except the path of subjugation, after which there will be no way back. We have chosen this road. The Iraqis have chosen this path. Over a long time, they are still working for more, and this would increase their belief, and there is no other way, and we will defend this path.
And you have to understand the justice of the cause defended by Iraq. The martyrs of our people and of the Arab nation will be rewarded. God is great. God is great. A curse be on the losers.
As Saddam Hussein's speech was going out over Baghdad radio, his foreign minister was headed over to Moscow. Tariq Aziz is carrying Iraq's formal response to the Kremlin's 11th hour peace proposal. Saddam Hussein did not make any direct reference to that peace plan in his speech. Aziz is scheduled to arrive in Moscow at 1 o'clock Pacific time. The White House said that President Bush was disappointed by Saddam Hussein's speech. Spokesperson Marlin Fitzwater issued the official U.S. response less than an hour after the speech was broadcast. Fitzwater said it was nothing but, quote, the same invective the world has heard before. He said that U.S. forces remain on a steadfast course. When they'll make their move on the ground, nobody is saying. On Capitol Hill this morning, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney would not commit to a timetable, but he did make a promise. Cheney said that, quote, in the near future, one way or another, Iraqi forces will leave Kuwait. Echoes of Washington's response came from other Allied capitals. In London, Prime Minister John Major said that Saddam's speech offered, quote, no glimmer of hope. The Prime Minister also had some tough words about what may be coming next.
Any reasonable reading of his speech suggests no hint of compromise whatsoever, no acknowledgement of what he's done, no willingness to obey the Security Council resolutions, and nothing really that would bring this conflict to a conclusion.
How ready do you think that the troops are, and how decisive do you think the defeat is going to be that's going to be inflicted on Iraq?
There's no doubt about the outcome of the of the conflict. There is absolutely no doubt about that at all. The Iraqis will lose. That, I think, has been clear for some time and is certainly crystal clear now.
Joining us from Stanford is Angelo Codavia. He's a Middle East expert and a consultant for KPIX. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I understand that you were shocked when you heard Saddam's speech. What did you find most shocking?
That he did not accept the Soviet plan forthwith. I think he's still going to. I think it would be folly not to. Saddam has shown himself to be a rational man, and the rational thing to do right now for him is to withdraw from Kuwait and face the United States with a kind of nightmare scenario.
But in the speech, he gave no indication that he was even considering a withdrawal. But you're saying that doesn't mean that Tariq Aziz is actually carrying that message to Gorbachev?
Not at all. It is entirely possible that Tariq Aziz and Gorbachev will go on television and announce the beginning of a withdrawal.
So perhaps the radio address was a face-saving speech?
It may very well have
building?
been a face-saving speech. It may have been simply to rattle the Americans' cages, or it may have been a kind of deception. You know, it is something of a classic maneuver to say the opposite of what you are going to do, just before you are going to do it.
We've heard a lot about how the bombing has basically cut off communications in Iraq. How many people do you think heard this message in Baghdad and the rest of the country?
Oh, I think most people heard it because people rely nowadays on transistor radios. So, no, that was heard. That's not the problem.
And what kind of an effect do you think it'll have on the people of Iraq?
At the moment, I'm sure it deeply discourages them. They know what they're up against militarily. They know that really nothing has been done against the Allied forces. The troops in the field, if they heard it, must have simply resigned themselves to one kind of death or another. You know, these people know that if they try to leave their posts, they will be shot. On the other hand, this speech told them that they are going to face the brunt of the American armed forces, and that means death. So it may make them all the more delighted when Saddam actually does say he is making a tactical withdrawal, or simply a withdrawal without explanation to new positions.
How do you think this will be received in other Arab countries?
In other Arab countries, this is being, no doubt, this is being received as a sign of greatness, of heroism.
But those people don't have to live with the day-to-day bombing.
But they don't have to live with the day-to-day bombings. No, Saddam Hussein has been utterly cynical toward the people he controls. He has, but understand that thus far he has only sacrificed a small portion of the number of people that he sacrificed in the Iran-Iraq war, and he was able to hold on to power. The question today is not whether Iraqi troops are going to stay in Kuwait. They're going to get out one way or the other. The question is, will Saddam retain his power over his own people?
Do you care to venture any predictions at this point?
At this point, I'll venture that he'll stay on. George Bush, despite everything, has not yet said that it is the objective of the United States to remove him. Until that happens, Saddam Hussein has an out.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Codavia, for joining us this afternoon. There were other signs today that Iraq isn't ready to call it quits. It fired more Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia. 2 were aimed at Riyadh, the Saudi capital, in a rare daylight attack. Allied commanders say that Patriot missiles blew the Scuds out of the sky, sending debris into the desert. So far, there are no reports of damage or injury. And there's been no let-up in the Allied raids against Iraq either. U.S. forces continue to pound enemy targets in southern Kuwait. And as Peter Van Sant reports, the start of a ground war could come at any moment.
Coalition forces overnight continued what they call aggressive patrolling, knocking out enemy radars and several anti-aircraft positions. Iraqi troops are being blasted by rockets, bombs, and psychological warfare. British multi-rocket artillery streaking toward Iraqi soldiers and minefields. The coalition forces continue their around-the-clock softening up of enemy positions. Artillery blasts are also used to destroy Iraqi armor and detonate thousands of landmines, clearing the path for an invasion force which could move at any time.
We know we've hurt him some. We know we've destroyed a lot of his heavy weapons.
We've had some prisoners come across who have indicated morale is low. Nonetheless, we're not letting our guard down. We're preparing for the worst and hoping for the best.
U.S. forces, led by Apache attack helicopters, assaulted a large Iraqi bunker complex, destroying up to 15 of the shelters and capturing more than 450 Iraqi prisoners, the largest single-day capture of the war. But the U.S. also suffered some losses, 1 killed and 7 wounded during an artillery battle. But the warfare on the ground isn't limited to explosives and gunfire. Rock music is also being blasted across the lines, part of a psychological game to rattle Iraqi troops. Beleaguered Iraqi soldiers are also being urged to surrender. Powerful loudspeakers send the verbal artillery into Iraqi positions. Come out, they're told. Haven't you suffered enough? The pounding the Iraqis are taking is apparently causing some unrest. A U.S. military spokesman this morning said there have been demonstrations in several Iraqi towns, and that one of them was put down by gunfire. Peter Van Sant, CBS News in Saudi Arabia.
Supplies of ammunition for the Allied troops continue to pour into Saudi Arabia. These artillery shells are headed for the battle at the front. In fact, the scale of this war cargo is unparalleled. According to the military, the number of supplies that have come through Saudi ports just in 3 months equals the amount unloaded during the first year of the Vietnam War. When we come back, if a ground war breaks out, it will be more than bullets that will be hurting Allied troops. There will be fire, too. Coming up, a look at a gel that will help treat GIs if they are burned. Injury that we're sure to see, burns. In this report, we learn about a gel treatment that will help the GIs. It could save their lives and painful treatment.
Warfare inflicts wounds by bullet and by fire. Of the two, fire creates hard-to-manage patients in pain and who easily slide to death. Now there's a jelly-like product that protects against and rapidly cools down burns. It kills pain, and it stops burning white phosphorus, a common battlefield chemical. A small company in Carlstadt, New Jersey, is supplying that material to the armed forces in Saudi Arabia.
Up to date, they've ordered approximately in excess of 10,000 blankets and several thousand burn dressings. As of last Friday, the battle for Khafji, our burn dressings and fire blankets were used for burn injuries.
The thick liquid, called water gel, is cool to the touch. It's approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Here, workers soak wool netting in the gel to make them into protective clothing. A year ago, as part of his Get Out Alive reports, our Frank Field demonstrated the blanket.
It's like having a spongy blanket on you. That's quite remarkable.
The wool netting is 2 sheets sewn together in 1-inch squares to absorb as much of the gel as possible. The gel itself is a mixture of water and exotic plant oils.
Although the tests show that water gel can protect you against fire, it's kind of hard to believe unless you see it close up, and that's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to dip my hand in the gel, make sure that all my fingers are covered, and then I'm going to light this flame and try it on my fingers. Except a little bit of warmth, I don't feel it.
It also comes in a robe like this, ordered by the Israeli government to rescue people aboard buses set afire by terrorist attacks.
And every school where there are children has to have a fire blanket on at least every floor.
Grossman says that the gel can stop the burning of white phosphorus. The phosphorus embedded in skin continues to burn. Under the gel, it stops. Earl Ubell for CBS.
Talks between Soviet diplomats and the Iraqi foreign minister continue, and the United Nations Security Council is set to be briefed on that proposal tomorrow.
That's Channel 7 News tonight. Thanks for watching.
We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
President Bush said the United States will consult with its coalition partners on the proposal. We are in the process of examining the Soviet initiative tonight. The United States and its coalition partners continue to prosecute the war.
Could this bring an end to the Gulf hostilities? We'll hear the Soviet view as we talk with a Kremlin spokesman for Mikhail Gorbachev live from Moscow tonight.
This is ABC News Night Live. reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Ted Koppel.
We are not, said Marlin Fitzwater this evening, a part of the negotiations. Well, maybe. The Soviets negotiate a peace plan with the Iraqis, then President Gorbachev conveys the plan to President Bush, and thereafter, after deliberating and discussing the plan with its coalition allies, Washington, again, to use Fitzwater's language, comments on the Soviet proposal to Moscow, which presumably then communicates again with the Iraqis. That may not be anyone's definition of a formal negotiation, but it comes awfully close. Unless tomorrow President Bush rejects the Soviet proposal out of hand, something approximating a negotiation seems to have started. And while the president's spokesman pointedly noted tonight that the air war continues, the possibility of a ground war seems to have diminished for the time being. We'll be going live to Moscow in a few minutes to talk with one of President Gorbachev's spokesmen, but first, here's a wrap-up of the latest developments from John Martin.
Had the look of light, polite opera.
So I do think that I can say a very good morning.
But the light applause reflected uncertainty. The dictator of Iraq had accepted a plan by the president of the Soviet Union. First, Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Second, troops would begin to leave the day after a ceasefire. Third, there would be a fixed timetable for withdrawal. Fourth, when 2/3 of Iraqi forces have withdrawn, United Nations economic sanctions would cease to apply to Iraq. Fifth, after all Iraqi forces withdrew, all remaining UN resolutions against Iraq would cease to exist. Sixth, after the ceasefire, both sides would release all prisoners. Seventh, the withdrawal would be monitored by countries chosen by the UN Security Council. Eighth, further details would be given to the UN tomorrow. In Washington, the president's advisors gathered tonight at the White House to decide what to do. The president went in a motorcade to Ford's Theater as planned. There, the audience gave him an ovation when he entered and as he went to his seat. Meanwhile, his spokesman, Marlin Fitzwater, appeared in the briefing room. He said President Gorbachev had spoken for 33 minutes with President Bush to outline the plan.
President Bush thanked President Gorbachev for his intensive and useful efforts, but raised serious concerns about several points in the plan.
According to the Soviets, Mr. Bush expressed his reservations, but was basically positive about the plan. Bush told Gorbachev he'd have to discuss the withdrawal plan with other members of the coalition.
Does President Bush see now here a chance for the first time since August 2nd to reverse the invasion of Kuwait and actually come about this without launching a ground war?
Well, there have been innumerable chances since August 2nd in the sense that Saddam Hussein could have pulled out at any time. That still is the fastest and most efficient way to end this war. In terms of this initiative, it's just too soon to characterize it. We need to take a look at it, but I would say again that we have had our hopes raised before. There's been no decision on the ground war at this time, and we continue to pursue the matter in the Persian Gulf in the most effective and efficient military way possible.
In London tonight, the British Prime Minister's office said the plan didn't seem to add anything or seem compatible with conditions expressed by the British. At the United Nations, the Egyptian ambassador called the peace plan only a good first step.
Of course, there are other points, too, concerning the return of the legitimate government of Kuwait, and also the repealing the annexation decision, the Iraqi decision to annex Kuwait, and the recognition of Kuwait as a sovereign state.
From Israel, ABC's Dean Reynolds got this reaction.
The announcement from Moscow is not good news for Israel. Officials here believe that Saddam Hussein must be removed from power if there is to be peace in the Middle East. Israeli officials were happy to hear that the air war is continuing, but they had hoped for a White House rejection of this plan. That hasn't happened, and as one official here told me, the Americans may now have some problems on their hands.
In a speech earlier, Saddam Hussein had seemed to forecast opposition from the United States, apparently complaining about reports that the Allies want Iraqi armor and artillery equipment left behind.
Now, Bush and the others speak about things that they never spoke about before or after August.
If his response to the Soviet proposal is rejected, he warned, Iraq would fight on.
This would strengthen our will and would strengthen the will and the readiness of our armed forces. They will be more patient and more ready for the confrontation that will be blessed by God.
In the Gulf, the military forces waited. Pilots slumped in ready rooms, the weather too poor to fly. At an artillery outpost not far from the border, enlisted men said that despite all the preparations, they were as prepared to go home as they were to go into combat. So was one of their officers.
Do you think there'd be any disappointment here if we didn't go through with the invasion that we've worked so hard to put together?
No, I agree with these guys. You know, we came over here to show force, ready to go to war. We proved our point. We're ready. I mean, we're ready. There's no doubt about that. If it need be, we'll go in and finish it off. But right now, hopefully he pulls out and we can get on with our lives.
This is John Martin for Nightline in Washington.
When we come back, we'll go live to Moscow, where the peace plan originated, and talk with an official spokesman for Mikhail Gorbachev, Sergei Grigoriev. And later, we'll hear from the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Les Aspin. As the assistant to President Gorbachev's chief spokesman will be joining us live from Moscow in a moment. But first, we thought it might be useful to set up a menu of points to be discussed with Sergei Grigoriev. Issues that could be among those troubling U.S. and coalition policymakers this evening. The UN Security Council resolutions call, among other things, for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Iraqi forces to the positions they occupied on August 1st, 1990. The Soviet plan ignores that last point and breaks the withdrawal into two distinct phases. The Soviet plan also calls for the removal of all economic sanctions, with 1/3 of Iraqi forces still inside Kuwait. There is also no reference to the payment by Iraq of reparations to Kuwait, nor is there any reference to the restoration of the legitimate